Hello, everyone, and welcome to our conversation. I'm Jane Robertson, the Content and Communications Director for Frog Systems, the creators of the employee wellbeing streaming service, Ashia. Welcome to this important conversation about how to create a workplace culture that supports employees who have been impacted by domestic abuse. In this discussion, we're going to look at some of the signs that might suggest that an employee is going through domestic abuse, what to do if they disclose this to you, what support to offer, and importantly, what support to offer in the long term if they are trying to leave that abusive relationship. Please note that this will be a sensitive discussion, which may lead people to disclose details or experiences of domestic abuse, or recognise that this has been their personal experience or that of a colleague. So please look after yourself, leave if you have to, and if there are people around you, you might want to just pop on a pair of headphones. With domestic abuse impacting over 2 million adults in the UK every year, we know that this is an issue that is present in a large number of workplaces, and yet it is rarely spoken about. So I'm delighted that we've got three experts to guide us and educate us through this conversation. Aisha Fordham is Membership and Partnerships Manager at the Charity Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse, or AIDA, which helps employers gain the tools and best practice to take effective action against domestic abuse by supporting their employees. Welcome, Aisha. AIDA's member organisations employ over a quarter of the UK's workforce, and one of those members is National Grid. Anna Rowland is Group Physical Health Lead at National Grid and leads on their domestic abuse awareness. Hi, Anna. And Dr. Nicola Sharp-Jeffs is the founder of the charity Surviving Economic Abuse and an expert in economic abuse as it occurs within the context of coercive control. Nicola has an OBE for services to victims of domestic and economic abuse. Hi, Nicola. If you would like to ask a question of any of our experts, as always, please do post it in the comments. And if you want to share some personal information, just please be aware that this is a public forum. Now, one of the first things to say is that, yes, we're aware we are four white women talking about domestic abuse. Aisha, domestic abuse happens to everybody, doesn't it? It's not just people like us.
Yeah, it really does happen to anybody. And, we see this working, with businesses, organisations, that it really does impact anybody regardless of gender, sexuality, socioeconomic background, race. It crosses across all different types of sectors and industries. So it's really important to recognise that it can impact anybody.
And we will pick that up in our conversation today. So I guess what I wanted to do to sort of really kick off the conversation was to define what we see as domestic abuse. Anna, how do you view that definition within National Grid?
Yeah, I mean, we obviously look at the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 when we're defining it. We are currently revising our guidance on this. So it is a definition that includes the different categories of domestic abuse. It is defined as abuse perpetrated from one person to another that's in an intimate relationship, living in the same household. It does exclude anyone under the age of 18 because that's classed as child abuse. But it is really important in any awareness campaigns that you provide that definition to people so they know exactly what it is, and refer people to those guidance documents such as the Domestic Abuse Act and the statutory supporting documents so that people understand what it is, and at the same time keeping it as simple as possible so that people can really understand quickly what that looks like. But as we've said, it cuts across different sections of society at all levels. It can happen to anyone. No category is excluded. So yeah, just being really clear about what it is important.
Yeah, and Nicola, your charity focuses in on the economic side of this. So can you kind of explain a little bit more about how that sits within the general definition of domestic abuse?
Absolutely. So as we've acknowledged, domestic abuse is all sorts of behaviour where one person is controlling another. So they might do that through isolation, intimidation, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and economic abuse, which is the specific form of control that we focus on at Surviving Economic Abuse. And really, overall, it's about trying to make someone's world smaller, to limit their freedom, the ability to make choices, and often stopping them from making that choice to leave because the perpetrator doesn't want that. So in terms of economic abuse specifically, you can start to see how economic resources really underpin physical safety. If someone is physically abusing you and you want to leave, but you don't have the money to leave, then you're going to have to stay longer and experience more harm as a consequence. So economic safety, when we're thinking about domestic abuse, is really, really important. And it looks very different. It might look like restriction in some cases. Some victims and survivors are not actually allowed to work. They may be allowed to work, but the perpetrator might insist that their wages are paid into a bank account that they haven't got any access to. So we would see that as exploitation because they don't have access to the money that they've earned. Or they might be able to work and they might be able to access the money in their bank account from their wages, but the abuser refuses to contribute to household costs, for example, and may run up debts in the victim survivor's name, which leaves them with, seeing the money go in on payday and going out immediately on all the household bills, the childcare, debt repayments, and leaving them with no disposable income at all, which might be another reason why they're unable to access the money that they do need to leave. So economic abuse will look very different, but it has that same result in terms of limiting choices and limited freedom.
Yeah. Aisha, is domestic abuse sort of more prevalent in any particular industries, in any particular sectors of the economy? Because you worked in the City of London before joining AIDA, didn't you? And were very much involved in strategy there around domestic abuse.
Yeah, so I worked in the City of London as an independent domestic violence advocate, and actually within that role I was able to go into people's workplaces and provide them support during their working day, so really seeing the impact that it can have frontline when a workplace actually implements the response and enables somebody to be able to access that support. But no, it doesn't. It isn't more prevalent in certain sectors or industries. It can present in different ways in different types of workplaces. So for example, a sort of a front-facing shop, or something where members of the public can access, they may be more at risk from the perpetrator, the abusive person actually coming into that place, without that kind of safety and security that they may have within an office environment if that abusive person doesn't actually work there as well. But depending on the industry or the sector or the organisation, there may be a culture where there's perhaps that psychological safety where people feel able to disclose. That's really important in the kind of the individual organisation actually enabling somebody to feel, to get that support. If there isn't that kind of workplace culture where people feel able to speak out, then they're not going to be able to speak out and get access to that support.
Anna, at National Grid, you sort of took this up and became very much the focus and the lead on this in your organisation because of personal experience, didn't you? Can you tell us a little bit, without obviously disclosing anything you're really uncomfortable with, about how that came about, Anna, and what you experienced?
Yeah, absolutely. So we at National Grid have been covering domestic abuse for about 8 years. And that included things like running awareness sessions and webinars, etc. But then 6 years ago, and this is all via our health and wellbeing team where I work, 6 years ago, unfortunately, I began a relationship that ended up being abusive. And I was working at National Grid, and due to that experience and the response of my manager at the time, it really made me think of how important it is that we continue this work and we really embed it within our strategy, because quite simply a workplace response can be life-changing and potentially life-saving for somebody. And I believe in my case that that's what happened in that moment of making decisions to actually leave the relationship, which can be the most dangerous time for somebody in a situation. what happened was my manager effectively gave me agency that I needed in that moment, and gave me the confidence that National Grid would support me in actually physically leaving the area, because I'd relocated from Cheshire, where I moved back to Warwick, where National Grid's head office is. And she was naturally good at that. She was the UK Health and Wellbeing Manager. But another person may have got a different response from a different manager who may not have had those capabilities. So that really galvanised me. So once I returned from maternity leave and picked back up my role, I really clung on to the domestic abuse work and took it forward, because I realised just how impacting it was. And obviously we know how prevalent it is. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 to 7 men experience it in their lifetime. So that has been a huge motivating factor for me. And, we've gone on to do a lot of work since then.
Can we talk about some of the tactics that the abuser might use then to impact the person who is, trying to go and hold down a job? Nicola, you've sort of alluded to some of the financial tactics that can be used, but can we sort of go into that in a little bit more detail? If I'm trying to sort of hold down a job, what sort of tactics, what sort of sabotage might they be using to try and affect my ability to do well in my job and get out of the house?
I mean, I think just to experience domestic abuse in any form will invariably interfere with someone's ability to work, because of the impact that will have on an individual. But certainly looking at it from an economic abuse perspective, which will be control over economic resources. So that would be money, finances, but anything that money can buy. So we see perpetrators sabotaging someone's ability to get to work, for example. They may cut up or burn their work clothes. They might take the car keys away from the victim survivor. They might hide their bus or train pass, for example. So the resources that you need to be able to get to work. Similarly, if you're working from home and or you rely on work equipment, so maybe a laptop or a mobile phone, again, an example of economic resources, the abuser in this case might deliberately damage those. They might also stop the survivor from accessing things like the ability to have their hair cut, to buy the clothes that they want to buy. They might not be allowed to shower or use hot water, turn the heating on, again, without the perpetrator's permission. So their sort of presentation within work might suffer, and that might have a negative impact on their ability to work as well, especially if they're externally facing. And also, as I mentioned, not having the equipment to actually do the job in the first place. We see isolation from work colleagues, so perhaps those spaces and places where work colleagues might pick up on something being wrong because the survivor doesn't have enough money to go for lunch, for example, or to go for a drink at the end of the day. Again, we see abusers stopping somebody from advancing at work. So one sign might be an employee not putting themselves forward for promotions or taking up opportunities because they know that the partner wouldn't support that. And then we see sort of on the other hand, the situations where victim survivors, do have access to all the economic resources they need, but the perpetrator is refusing to contribute and exploiting them. So they might just be working, multiple jobs, taking on extra shifts, overtime, staying late because they're having to cover all the costs, paying off debt that might have been taken out in their name. And there might be other behaviours, where they might be working right up until a baby is due, for example, or coming back from maternity leave very quickly. So there's just a few ways in which economic abuse might touch someone's ability to perform their job and to stay within it, and certainly to advance their career and and to progress.
Yeah. Oh, it sounds horrific. And Aisha, and then there's the possibility of that they'd be suffering from physical violence as well. Is that something that you might spot in the workplace at all?
Yeah, you could spot that through sort of visible physical injuries of a colleague. So, asking the question, if they're okay. And, an individual might not want to talk about any physical injuries that they have, or they may kind of mask it or try and sort of deny or minimize what's going on. That's quite common with victims and survivors of domestic abuse, to actually really minimize the level of abuse. But actually, creating opportunities for that individual to talk about what's happening, letting them know that you're a trusted person, and then when they feel able to open up about it, then they have that opportunity to do so. So if you do spot those signs in somebody and those kind of physical injuries, then really asking the question and checking in with them. Something that so at IDA we have ambassadors, so we have 13 ambassadors who are people with lived experience of domestic abuse, and nearly all of them talk about that they just wish somebody had asked the question, are they okay? And a couple of them can remember 1 or 2 times that somebody at work asked them, but they just said they just wished that they asked and just kept asking, because that would have allowed them the opportunity to disclose when they were ready to do so.
So Anna, you mentioned that you been through this abusive relationship. Can I ask sort of what prompted you to speak to that manager at the time? How did you feel safe? How were you made to feel that was actually the best way for you to sort of disclose what was happening to you? Because as we've heard, it's quite a difficult thing for somebody to disclose what's happening to them.
Yeah, so it's all of these relationships are very unique and complex, and often people don't even realize what's happening to them, myself included, certainly at the beginning of the relationship. So it took a while for it to really resonate with me. And often, as our relationship was, I'd moved 100 miles away from my family and friends, so we were very much in a bubble where I didn't get other people's perspective as to what was happening, which was key to the longevity of the relationship. So over time, I would say things at work and people would raise their eyebrows. One thing that was going through my head when Aisha was talking about, types of abuse and how it shows up is the phrase, somebody that's trying to regulate your everyday behaviour. And it just started to become very clear that my house was not a safe place. I would also talk about power and control. It was becoming very clear that he wanted to be king of the castle, which you can see in like the Duluth wheel of power and control and how it shows up. And I just started to get that valuable perspective as to the way that I was being treated was abusive. It wasn't normal. And because it's your life, it's very difficult to accept that. There's a lot of embarrassment in some cases, shame, etc. So, and also when I became pregnant and I left 6 months after that, it is often the case in relationships of abuse that the abuse can elevate once a woman's pregnant. And again, that happened in my case, and it just hit me that I was not in a safe relationship. And it's the realization that I'm also carrying a child, I'm going to bring it into that environment. So over those 6 months, my performance started to be impacted at work. I wanted to be at work and I was happy. I was really happy in my pregnancy, but I felt very trapped. And my manager started to notice things weren't right. And then it all came to a head one week when I discovered that he had been physically violent in a previous relationship. And that's when my world basically collapsed, because it was an understanding that this cannot go on, and I had to leave a house that I just purchased with him. It was big. And I basically showed a couple of messages to my manager, which she responded in a way that was, if you don't feel safe, this is something that this is a situation you need to physically leave. And that's what happened. It all happened really quickly. She didn't make any decisions for me, which is, something we don't recommend, that managers aren't there to step in and judge and make decisions. It's very much led by the person experiencing domestic abuse. They know their situation better than anyone. They know probably how to stay safe in some cases. But I think, you do feel a little bit embarrassed. It's your relationship. It's the person you think you're going to spend the rest of your life with. So there was a whole lot of emotions. But the most important thing was for me and my child baby unborn baby to be safe. And that's what led to my decision to leave. But it was very much facilitated and supported by my manager.
Yeah, and Aisha, and thank you so much for sharing that, Anna. And I'm so glad that you're out of that relationship, and that you're in hopefully a lot better place. Aisha, I think you've helped a number of people over the time that you've worked to make decisions about their future and get out of abusive relationships. But as Anna was sort of saying, there's that sort of there's the private relationship part of it, and then how much do you step in as an employer? How do you sort of bridge that difficult sort of decision as to what you can do as an employer to help, but without overstepping your legal, strategic responsibilities?
Yeah, well, one of our sort of key messages at IDA is that you're not expected to be an expert. So really taking away that fear of saying or doing the wrong thing, and being able to, put those kind of boundaries in place in terms of the level of support that an employer can offer. So there are plenty of specialist services, specialist domestic abuse services locally and nationally that can provide that expert support. But really what employers can do is just be that safe place where somebody, it could be somebody's only safe space, the workplace. So it's really about enabling somebody to feel like they can speak out, realise they're not alone, and then be signposted to that specialist support. It's really important for people that are providing that support internally within an organisation. So whether it be HR, domestic abuse champions, just sort of, any colleague, that they really are kind of guided by what that individual wants, because they might not want to leave that situation. It might just be a matter of actually wanting to tell somebody what's going on and feel like they're not alone in that situation. But, it's not the job of the employer or that individual supporting them to actually encourage or support them to leave that situation. It's really just about listening to what it is that they need, and then being able to signpost them to that specialist support.
Yeah. I just look at one of the questions that we've been asked, because I think it's probably quite relevant at the moment. And thank you for asking it, from Better Lives. Outsiders often say, why did you not leave the relationship sooner? We've all heard that before, haven't we? Could the panel explain how difficult it is to notice what's going on? And once you do, how difficult it is to get out? I guess that's the sort of personal piece about how do you get out, but also, noticing that. Maybe Aisha, you could pick up on that. If you think something's wrong, and the person hasn't said, how can you encourage them to make some positive decisions to get themselves out of it?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of 2 points to the question there. I mean, why did you not leave the relationship sooner? There's 2 parts to that, because one part of it is the fact that power and control that we've talked about, that stops somebody from being able to leave an abusive situation. The isolation, the economic abuse, not having access to finances, to housing, to that emotional support. All of that is controlled by the abusive person. So, if they left, where would they go? Where is their place of safety? Who do they have for that support? So really, that why didn't they just leave? It's just not possible for somebody to do that without that support. And secondly, people don't recognise themselves as being in abusive situations. Again, like our ambassadors talk about this, and they share how it wasn't until they were out of that situation, or somebody said to them, is everything okay? And they kind of recognised it themselves, or somebody showed them that power and control wheel that Anna referenced, the Duluth wheel, where they see it kind of written out there, the different types of abuse and what a domestic abuse relationship looks like, and then they recognise that in themselves. So, if you have concerns for somebody that they are showing any of the signs that we've spoken about today, just really highlighting that and asking them if things are okay, maybe doing some research around domestic abuse and speaking to them about it, in a sort of sensitive way, if you feel like you're able to do that, because they might not even see it themselves.
And I guess, Nicola, this is where the sort of training piece comes in, isn't it? For somebody who's in the workplace who does want to offer some support and help, it's important to kind of have some training to know how to deal with these difficult situations if you come up against them.
Yes, I mean, I think, first of all, it's also just important, I think, to flag that it's not always safe to leave, because parent control is a dynamic where if the victim does challenge that control over them, then the abuse will escalate, and people aren't always aware that, you know, it is that point of separation or soon after. Sadly, victims are more likely to lose their lives. So I say that not to scare people, but to really be victim-led, because they will know what is safe for them and what is not. So the piece about training, you know, is not about being able to provide that specialist support. As Aisha said, you know, that can be provided by specialist domestic abuse services, but it's really important to know that they're available to partner with them. You know, training is really helpful to help you understand what economic abuse is, specifically domestic abuse more broadly, because it helps you pick up on the signs, to recognise the dynamics. And, you know, I think most importantly, you know, to have a policy in place, as Anna's already referred to know what you can do. So, you know, can you remove some of those barriers? So if the victim survivor is saying, you know, I can't, you know, afford to leave, you know, because this is where my wages are going, you know, as an employer, can you provide a free, you know, some free money? Certainly during COVID, a number of firms introduced, you know, grants for victims and survivors, paid for hotel accommodation, supported them around accessing legal advice to leave, provided paid leave so that they could go and do the things that they needed to do. As Anna said, you know, providing that agency, providing that freedom for them to go off and do the things that they needed to do, you know, to be safe, but knowing, you know, that they had a security of a job to come back to, you know, because I will go back to that economic safety piece. You know, the one thing you can do as an employer is support that person to stay, you know, in their job, within their vocation, you know, to have that, will support them if they don't have that economic independence moving forward, but certainly to create that stability, you know, so that they can live independently, so that they can rebuild their lives, you know, and they don't have to either be dependent or tied to somebody. So, you know, I think training is very important, but, you know, as I say, not training to be the specialist, not to solve the problems, you know, but just to be able to recognise the signs, to know what to do, to know how to do that safely, and to recognise the ways in which, you know, as an employer, as I say, you can remove some of those barriers to safety. And even in and of itself, you know, having a policy, you know, recognising economic abuse in your day-to-day conversations, or domestic abuse more broadly. We've picked up on maternity leave. You know, we've talked about how pregnancy is a risk factor where domestic abuse will either start or escalate. You know, if someone that is going on maternity leave, wonderful opportunity actually just to have a conversation with them about, have they thought about their finances? You know, how are things going to happen when their maternity leave allowance, you know, becomes a bit less? Have they had a conversation with their partner about childcare? You know, and who's going to pay for that? You know, you can create, you know, just very normal conversations, which provide spaces for someone, you know, to share something, you know, with you, which, you know, could make all the difference.
Yeah. Anna, could we come to talk then about the sort of policy and approach of National Grid? What have you put in place that you have found really works on this issue of domestic abuse?
I mean, first of all, I'd say awareness raising is absolutely key, because a lot of people do not know what domestic abuse really is, how it shows up, all the different areas, you know, of what it can be, that it's not just physical violence. A lot of people still just believe it's physical violence, not, you know, emotional, psychological, including the coercive control elements, economic, obviously, that we're talking about today. So definitely you need to have a strategic plan, really, if you want it to be successful and be long term and have a lasting cultural impact. So awareness raising is one thing, and then you do need to have like a foundation that supports any awareness training, and such as guidance or policy. Now in the Domestic Abuse Act, they do refer to guidance or policy. We actually have a guidance document, not a policy. It is something that I'm actually revising at the moment, so drawing on lots of different things to make sure that the language is up to date, that it resonates with all levels of society, that it's very inclusive, that it's up to date with legislation and any changes. But again, that document needs to be very accessible, easy to read, understand by managers, colleagues. So we're currently doing that as well. Obviously, the training, any training that you do, I think training is really important. We're revising our training in July, that it's all cohesive. So potentially that training refers to any guidance or policy that an organisation has. And then understanding that this issue is not just a short-term issue. Each business unit needs to be a coordinated effort. So any guidance that you do write, you draw on potentially advice from your safety teams, ethics teams, safeguarding teams. This problem can show up anywhere in the workplace under any type of umbrella. So, but I would say that it is really important, and it's an obligation of an employer to have a guidance or policy. One thing I would also mention is senior leadership support to elevate this to, board level, exec level, to show again that the support at all levels. It shouldn't just be something that managers are tasked with supporting. It is a sensitive subject. People like to know that top down something like this is supported, and we have that senior support.
I was going to ask you also, Anna, I think when we were talking before we have this general discussion today, you'd said that you often do awareness raising webinars as well internally. But one of the key things to remember about that is that those might encourage, and often do encourage, people to share their experience and realise that they're maybe going through domestic abuse themselves. So can you talk a little bit about the sensitivity around, don't just wade in and think, right, we're going to do a webinar tomorrow, let's do it. You even need to be sort of sensitive about how you do that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, like I said, for the last 8 years, we have covered things on domestic abuse, and I think it's always important to kind of certainly our communications experts would say, try and make it relevant and timely and sensitive. I mean, we do things like, we will do something just before Christmas, because it is a time that people can, again, there are elevated calls to domestic abuse charities around Christmas. Things like sports events, the World Cup, football, there is a link between increasing domestic violence there. So making it, raising awareness and giving it a bit of context for people. Very simply, we always do a trigger warning, just like you have today, to make sure that you are understanding that there are going to be people that could be sensitive to this, and giving them the option to, dial out or just be prepared. We always signpost to our internal services, so EAP, make sure those third-party providers are set up to understand trauma-led responses, for example. For people that are experiencing domestic abuse, that person-led, trauma-led response is really important. So as you can see, when we talk about this subject, there are so many areas that you need to try and get your arms around as an employer, and it is a challenge. But for the person taking in the information, a colleague, a manager, it's really important that you get those steps right. But working with people like Ida make that really easy, because they are the experts. So yeah, we've really benefited from that relationship. Yeah. Give Ida a call if you want support in how to, I've been doing this a while now and I've got personal experience, but for anyone thinking about this subject, it is actually really easy to get it right if you consult with specialists like Ida. So equally, it can go wrong if you don't follow certain steps. So I would just encourage people, get that, guidance in place, get your resources in place. Preferably before you do any awareness training, awareness or training. Make sure those foundational aspects are in place. Otherwise, you will open people's eyes to a problem and not be able to support it effectively.
Yeah. A big plug for the work that you do there, Aisha, at Ida. And I just wanted to sort of come back where Anna was talking about the importance of making sure that different business units are connected on this issue as well. So, an individual might not stay in the same job in the workplace. As we know, if somebody is trying to leave a relationship that's abusive, it can take many, many years to do that. So how does the employer need to sort of think about that kind of long-term piece, the maternity piece, the payroll piece? There's lots of different parts of this jigsaw, aren't they, that must be quite difficult for employers to bring together sometimes.
Yeah, and it's really about creating a culture within the organisation. We talked about that quite a lot today, where people feel able to come forward and disclose that. And that goes much broader than just domestic abuse. It's about creating that environment where people feel safe and they trust the organisation, and really about building that domestic abuse response. Many of the things that have been talked about and that Anna just mentioned, the policy, the training, asking those questions, those opportunities, building it into the fabric of the organisation. So can it be included within those recruitment processes, onboarding, promotions, one-to-ones, those questions, and just promoting that and talking about the policy, and letting people know that support is available. If you think about an organisation, they're going to have a sickness policy or a maternity policy, but actually a domestic abuse policy isn't something that many have. And a piece of research was done in 2019 that showed that only 5% of employers had a specific domestic abuse policy. We're hoping that's slightly higher now, but it's still, relatively still very low. So, unless it's talked about and it's kept kind of on the agenda within the organisation, people won't know it's there. So really kind of building into just standard conversations that support is available.
Yeah, thank you.
And we have, and just to mention, sorry, Jane, just to mention at IDA, we have a template domestic abuse policy, which is free for our members to use. So that's something that can be accessible, and it's updated yearly. So it goes through a legal review yearly, which is, to make sure it's obviously kept up to date.
Brilliant. Nicola, coming to the sort of financial aspect and looking at this sort of long-term picture, how does the payroll part or the HR part of an employer, try and either spot the signs of that somebody, isn't in control of their finances, and then what can they do? How much we talked about giving some help financially to somebody maybe who's trying to struggle with being restricted around their access to money or transport or whatever it is. Practically what can be done at that stage by an employer?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think training's so important, and there's a power in really bringing everyone in a business into that, because as I said, once you've had that understanding and the insight, certainly within our training, professionals immediately recognise what they could do differently to support survivors. And also quite often we'll talk about, with hindsight, looking back at certain situations, they then now recognise that perhaps abuse was happening. There'll be certain things, within payroll, for example, one really simple thing is just to look across your payroll and see if anyone is having their wages paid into an account in somebody else's name. Doesn't necessarily mean they're experiencing abuse, but you can ask the question, again, provide that space, an opportunity for someone to disclose. So again, within payroll, therefore, you could support a victim to change the bank account if it's safe for them to do so. Sometimes employers will be quite creative. Again, for example, if there's one of the employees gets a pay rise, it might be that some money can be paid into another bank account and not show up on the wage slip, for example, because again, we know that abusers might monitor things like wage slips, for example. So kind of finding ways to safely, and again, being led by the survivor here, find ways of sort of maximising their ability, perhaps just to put a little bit of money aside. People talk about escape funds, and there's a word I won't repeat, but certain types of funds, which are really important, that provide that kind of safety net for victims and survivors. So when they are in a situation where they feel that they are safe to leave, that they do have the resource available. But as I said, as an employer, you can really do as much or as little as you want in this space. You can provide that grant for employees. Certainly, we work really closely with financial services, and certainly within the financial services space, there's something called the Financial Abuse Code, which 29 firms covering 39 different brands are all signed up to. And that code creates a number of principles around how firms respond to customers. But actually, within that code is the need to support your employees, because, if you're in an externally facing space, you know, and you are supporting customers who are going to be experiencing economic abuse and domestic abuse more broadly, you know, you can't expect your employees to support them without having a level of support themselves. You know, so certainly, you know, one really powerful example here would be TSB, who before the government made the decision to create emergency funding for victims and survivors to leave, actually announced a £500 fee fund for any one of their customers. And what they immediately then did was ensure that, you know, their staff had access to £500 similarly, if they were experiencing domestic abuse. So certainly, you know, a number of the firms that we work with, you know, they won't provide us a response to customers, which they wouldn't provide to colleagues as well. So certainly, you know, in answer to the question about how many employers might be doing work around this and how much they might be doing, you know, there are certain industries, for example, who, you know, because of, you know, certainly regulation in the financial services space and having to respond to the needs of vulnerable customers, you know, it creates contexts which then enable them to do fantastic things for their employees as well. So, you know, there's some really great examples out there, and I would just, you know, encourage people listening, you know, to have a look at certainly at the Surviving Economic Abuse website, you know, just to get some ideas there, because, you know, back to what Anna said at the beginning, you know, your support can be, you know, both life changing but also life saving.
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. Long-term support, Anna, you know, it takes a long time. It can often take months, years to get out of an abusive relationship. So what does our audience need to sort of think about in regards that sort of, if they do get to leave the relationship, which hopefully they do, that kind of post-separation abuse that can happen as well, which is something that, you know, is going to be equally as difficult, I guess, as the time when they were actually sort of struggling with the actual physicality of what was happening.
Yeah, so just drawing on my own experience, then I'll speak more generally. So just to give some context, so my relationship was 2 years, and the post-separation abuse lasted 4 years, and that included family court, because obviously there's a child involved, which is a mechanism that a lot of abusers use to continue the abuse via the family courts. So therefore, once somebody does leave, if they do leave, then the abuse is very likely to continue for a while, a number of years. My post-separation abuse ended only last November due to a decision in court. So during that time, obviously I've been working on this domestic abuse strategy and being given that perspective and that experience of how absolutely traumatic going to court is, to basically fight for the safety of your child. When children are involved, it does complicate things. I read that the average child contact case lasts around 7 years. So employers do need to be aware that these situations don't just disappear very quickly when someone leaves. They are often very much dragged out for years and years, and it's absolute torture for people, quite honestly. So, you know, again, my employer absolutely stepped in, and during that time, which, to be quite honest, if they hadn't been supportive and it would have put more pressure on me and stress, I honestly don't know if I would have been able to keep my job, my functionality. But my manager was so understanding. He never made me use holidays or annual leave for court appearances. I had to attend court every 4 to 5 months over those 4 years. So it was a lot of time. He was just extremely understanding. He would appreciate that maybe before or after court, it would not be a great time for me to be working. He would show that understanding and support. So yeah, that is a real situation for people, that this is not something that just ends. It is very likely to continue, and often that person requires just as much support as they do during the time that they're in that situation. So very, very worth knowing. Yeah.
Aisha, that flexibility both in hours, being able to take time off to deal with what you're going through as you're trying to extricate yourself from the relationship. But I guess also what Anna was saying there is having somebody who is sympathetic and empathetic, that they understand some of the stuff that you're going through, so that, for instance, if you're having an annual, review of your work performance, that you're not penalized for, not always turning up, in the right frame of mind, having to take a little bit of extra time off. It's so important, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is so important, and that piece around, the awareness of the post-separation abuse is so important, because the abuse doesn't end when the relationship ends, as Anna has spoken about, and that flexible working, it needs to continue for so long as that individual needs it. The organisation needs to have an understanding that might be, so many years after the abuse has after that person has left that abusive situation, and they might have various appointments they need to go to, housing appointments, meetings, police, court hearings, counselling, and for that individual to be able to access that and still be able to do their job with the support from the workplace is massively important. And just going back to a point that Anna made earlier around when she was talking about the abuse internally, and she had a support from your manager, that's why a policy or guidance is so important within an organisation. So there's that consistent response for everybody, and there's something really powerful for an individual that's experiencing that abuse, who's being controlled through every part of their life, to actually be able to see what support is available to them before they disclose, and they can go to that policy, they can have that reassurance that support is in place, and actually take a bit of that control back. So the policy is instrumental in so many kind of avenues, and setting out that support in terms of that flexible working in the policy is great, and also kind of acknowledging within that policy that there is not everything's going to be named in there, because the response needs to be led by that individual survivor and tailored to them, and they'll know what support they need best. They'll know what kind of things that will help them, so the organisation can have that flexibility as well in terms of the support they offer to each person.
Yeah. And Nicola, the the awareness right through from the top of the organisation right through to the managers. One of the important things, I guess, is whatever policy or guidance you've got in place, it needs to be visible. People need to know about it. Don't create a policy or a guidance document and hide it away somewhere. It needs to be shared, and people need to know about it.
Yeah, it's back to our culture point, I think. There's no point gathering dust on a shelf. It's really important. You can have lunch and learns as part of the introduction of the policy. Awareness raising in lots of different forms. I know, again, some of the firms that we work with, really powerfully, senior level management will speak about their experiences, and that's really helpful, because that really does help reduce that shame and that stigma. This really can happen to everybody, which is the first point that we made today. So it's about sort of creating that ability to have spaces and confidence, again, for employees, to know that there is support available if they need it, that they don't have to manage alone, that there will be consistency in terms of what that response looks like. Because certainly, again, from an economic abuse perspective, we can see the impact, last for decades. Anna's already talked about repeatedly, having to go to family court. A lot of abusers deliberately do that, to continue to the control, but also to drain a victim survivor of any economic resources they have. If you're working, it might be that you don't qualify for legal aid, so you're having to pay those legal fees yourself, and that can be terribly expensive. Again, the abuser might have, a really expensive legal team. A lot of victims and survivors, also get to a point where they run out of resources and they actually have to prepare, for those court hearings themselves and represent themselves. That takes a lot of time and energy, makes it very difficult, to be working alongside, preparing for court cases. Anna also mentioned that she'd just taken a mortgage out with her ex-partner, again, if you've got joint financial responsibilities, that can be very difficult to unpick, which again is one of the reasons that we work so closely with financial institutions, to find ways again to remove the barriers. We have perpetrators, one example during the cost of living, if there's a joint mortgage and, despite separation, refusing to agree a new rate of interest for that mortgage, making the mortgage payments a lot higher. If the victim survivor, wants to keep a good credit rating, wants to keep a roof over their heads, doesn't want to go into arrears and perhaps lose the property, maybe will spending, a huge amount of their salary on mortgage repayment. So, this is so all-encompassing, really, and I think it just points to the the importance of just having that kind of invitation to tell that support is available, and employers doing what they can to wrap themselves around that survivor and enable them to get through that time, because it's really challenging.
Thank you, all three of you, for your expert insight today, and Anna in particular for sharing your experience as well. We really, really appreciate it, and very thankful that you're not in that position anymore. And thank you to everybody who's commented and shared their advice about where to go for support and help. But I just want to sort of end the conversation really by asking you all really what you'd like to sort of leave with the audience today, some particular points that they can take away and have a think about if they're looking to try and raise awareness of this issue in their workplaces. So Anna, perhaps we could sort of start with you. What would you like to sort of share about what you've learned and what National Grid have done that would be useful for people to take away today?
Oh, there's so much I could say, Jane. So I would just say galvanise a number of people to support what you're doing. So I'm thinking about the audience that we've got here. There's going to be people that are leading this sort of by themselves, a bit like I have been doing. But what I've learned is that it can't just be one person. You have to build up those network of allies, and really, I would say specialist support is key in this, in managing this subject, this situation effectively. So I would certainly say, use your networks and specialist support. The second thing I would love to say is that I want to state that I'm an example of what can happen if support is done effectively. So I am now safe, thriving, high functioning as I used to be. And I want to send a positive message that this really matters, and it changed my life. My employer actually was a pillar in my life that I could lean on, that wasn't I wasn't afraid. I knew I had my employer supporting me, and it's just kept me going. So if we can get this right, it can really make a huge positive impact on people. So big thumbs up and positivity from me as someone that's come out the other side. Luckily, I was lucky in a lot of ways, and one of those ways was I was at National Grid.
And National Grid are a beacon member of Aisha, so I'm struggling to say both those things together. What does being a beacon member mean, and how can the people in the audience today, if they want their employer to get involved and get some access to training and resources from you, how can they go about doing that?
Yeah, so being a beacon member is really about being an organisation that is committed to implementing a response internally for your people, and using your platform and your resources to support other organisations, smaller organisations, larger organisations, to also encourage them to do the same. So being that voice for why it's important, really. And they obviously get that kind of more support from us. So we work very closely with National Grid and with Anna, and it's a really great group of members. IDA is free to join for those. Generally it's a free organisation. We have a handbook which we recently launched, which is a step-by-step guide to how to implement an effective domestic abuse response. All of our resources are free for our members to use. We put on events, we've got loads of information. So please, I would encourage you to sign up if you can.
Excellent. And Nicola, I think we've lost your visuals for the moment, but I hope you can still hear us. What would your what help does CE give to employer organisations, and what would you like to leave the audience with today? Oh, you're on mute, Nicola. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, apologies. I had someone want to deliver a parcel just as we were coming to the end. Of course, in all day, and it happens during this hour. Of course, it does. We on our website have a lot of information and resources, both for victims and survivors themselves, but also for professionals across a range of different industries, but also particularly for employers. So that would include things like, how to have a conversation. Points at which you might have a conversation. We've talked a lot about maternity, so someone going on maternity leave or coming back would be a really good opportunity. Talking about their financial well-being in relation to pensions, for example. So lots of kind of resources that would support employers to have those conversations. I would also just say from victim survivors perspective, we have talked about the challenges generally, but we do know that people with intersecting inequalities, so a Black disabled woman, for example, is going to need a particular response. So it's really important, and again, our web pages, have information about this, to kind of really tailor your responses to recognise that people will have additional barriers, and the need to provide information and support, around how you support victims and survivors, who are, have a number of inequalities which the perpetrator has taken advantage of. And, as a society, we need to be able to support them as well. So I think that's really important. And also, we provide training, again, for people across lots of different industries, including employers across the piece. I would encourage you, if you do this work, as I say, externally facing, and you have a customer base, and you provide financial services in any shape or form, to really encourage you, if you're not supporting your employees, to be doing that, because as I said a little bit earlier, you can't expect them to support customers without providing that support to themselves. And certainly we've got some information which I think can be circulated at the end of today's webinar as well, which sets all of that out.
Yeah, and if you want to go to the websites, it's eida.org.uk and survivingeconomicabuse.org. And as I say, there's loads and loads of information there. And people on our platform obviously have resources and signposted organisations, including both of those, to access as well. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. This conversation was brought to you by Frog Systems. Our wellbeing streaming service, Ashir, is a complete on-demand platform full of personal stories, expert advice, conversations like this one, and signposted support to help your employees through the challenges that they face in their life and to help you to be better managers. So do visit our website for more, where you can sign up for a free trial, and do follow us on social media. But that's it. Thank you to my guests, Aisha, Nicola, Anna. Thank you so much for your company. Thank you for watching. I really hope that this conversation helps you to bring positive change to your workplace. Enjoy the rest of your day.